Viewers particularly sympathized with Prince George and Princess Charlotte. According to The Guardian, at ages 9 and 7, Prince William and Princess Catherine's two eldest children were the youngest mourners in attendance.
Princess Charlotte is, well, a princess doesn't mean she is simply prim and proper. As a source told Us Weekly in 2018 about the little girl, she's definitely the biggest character of the three children at the moment.
It was an ordinary morning until Princess Charlotte disappeared. No alarms, no fanfare, just a chilling silence that unsettled the entire palace. The day began like any other at Kensington Palace, under a pale London sky. But as the early light streamed through the windows, there was something disturbingly unfamiliar in the air. A quiet so unnatural, so thick, it seemed to press against the walls. The palace, usually humming with the rhythm of royal routines, felt off. Something vital had shifted, and only those who truly lived its rhythm could sense it. The usual shuffling of footsteps in the East Wing, where Charlotte's quarters were, was gone. No sound of her cheerful voice bouncing off the marble. No clinking of teacups from her breakfast tray. Her tutors didn't arrive, and the footmen walked the halls more slowly, glancing toward the East Wing as though afraid of what they wouldn't find. It didn't take long for the royal staff to start noticing the pieces that were missing, not just physically, but emotionally. Her chambermaid, the woman who had cared for Charlotte since her toddler years, was seen pacing outside her room, eyes cast down, wringing her hands in a motion that betrayed deep worry. The nursery door remained shut. A window left slightly ajar allowed a breeze to stir the curtains in a way that felt haunting, like the room itself was breathing out a farewell. Something wasn't right, and those closest to the inner circle felt it in their bones. The guards didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their expressions alone told a story that had no words. Royal Protection Squad members began to appear in subtle clusters, their movements restrained yet deliberate. They weren't running, but they were everywhere, watching, listening, speaking into the cuffs of their tailored suits. Their presence wasn't declared, but it was unmistakably increased. Drones took flight overhead, higher than usual. A black vehicle idled longer than normal near the back entrance. Still, not a single official statement was issued. Not from the palace, not from the press. The usual crowd of royal reporters received nothing but polite declines and unusually vague reassurances. No one dared speak out, and yet, the silence itself was a broadcast. Outside the palace gates, life went on. Tourists wandered the gardens, locals jogged past the iron fences. But within, there was a tightening grip of anxiety. The routines that gave the monarchy its illusion of invincibility were breaking down. The tea didn't arrive. The dog's handler never showed. Even the royal nannies avoided eye contact. Every second that passed without explanation twisted the silence into something heavier, an unspoken emergency cloaked in denial. It wasn't a dramatic vanishing act with chaos and flashing lights. It was worse. It was invisible. And in that invisibility, the mystery only grew darker. Because Charlotte wasn't just absent, she was erased. Her usual routes, her trusted aides, her sounds, her scent in the hallway, all gone, as if they had been carefully lifted out of time. Even her personal assistant's sudden leave raised eyebrows, but no one had answers, only theories and fears. The truth was wrapped in veils, and every veil seemed to whisper a different version of what might have happened. But as the silence deepened, so did the questions. What could make a 10-year-old princess vanish without a trace? The answers everyone feared were locked behind one door, Charlotte's nursery. And what was missing spoke louder than words. Within, the East Wing of Kensington Palace, her door once so frequently opened by joyful hands remained sealed. No one entered. No one emerged. It stood untouched, guarded not by locks or armed men, but by an invisible barrier of grief and fear. For those who had once walked in and out freely, that door now represented something far heavier than absence. It was the final line between what once was and what could no longer be explained. Inside that room, if one dared to enter, was a heartbreaking stillness that no one was willing to disturb. But whispers from behind the walls revealed that something was no longer in its place. Her favorite stuffed animal, a threadbare companion from infancy, was gone. A small, worn ballet slipper, often found next to her wardrobe after practice, had vanished. Most unsettling of all was the note handwritten in Charlotte's unmistakable scrawl, left untouched on her desk. Its contents remained unread, too sacred or too dangerous for even the most trusted eyes. No one claimed to know what it said, and yet its presence, or perhaps its silence, haunted the staff. The emotional impact on those closest to her was undeniable. Seasoned footmen who had weathered decades of royal history were seen turning their eyes away, unable to hold their gaze upon the sealed door. One maid, a quiet, aging woman who had once brushed Charlotte's hair and buttoned her cardigans, was overheard sobbing quietly in the staff corridor. She wasn't crying out of ignorance. She knew something had changed. Something irreversible. Outside, in the dead of night, there were signs that the royal family was not merely hoping the situation would resolve itself. It was being managed, perhaps concealed. A black helicopter, unmarked, silent, and swift, was seen lifting off from the palace gardens under cover of darkness. There were no lights, no passengers recorded, no itinerary filed, just vanishing into the London sky like a secret fleeing its own truth. Meanwhile, subtle signs of high alert protocol began to creep into palace routine. Drones were flying noticeably higher. Surveillance vehicles were spotted near rarely used exits. Guards rotated more frequently, and some familiar faces were temporarily replaced with unknown personnel. Yet, not a single statement was issued. The royal press office remained as composed and impassive as ever, issuing nothing but routine replies and no comments. Even the most well-connected royal correspondents found themselves stonewalled. The only confirmation they could gather was that something had changed, and everyone at the palace was pretending it hadn't. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was the deliberate erasure of a presence so deeply woven into the palace that its absence left an echo. The room is sealed. The items are gone. The emotions choked down. Everything told a story no one dared to speak. Because once you acknowledge the truth, you could never unsee it. Before the world could speculate further, we had to ask, who exactly was this young girl that made even hardened royal guards weep? From the moment she was born, Charlotte wasn't just another royal, she was history in the making. On May 2, 2015, as bells rang across the United Kingdom, the birth of Princess Charlotte marked more than the arrival of a new member of the monarchy. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in royal succession. For the first time in British history, a royal daughter would not lose her place in line to the throne to a younger brother. In a system built on centuries of male primogeniture, Charlotte shattered that rule the moment she took her first breath. Quietly, without fanfare, she became the first girl to retain her rank just by existing. But Charlotte was never going to be just a footnote in a constitutional reform. She was born to stand out. Even as a toddler, the public couldn't help but notice how she carried herself chin up, steps measured, presence steady. It wasn't long before whispers turned into headlines, and headlines into admiration. Royal watchers nicknamed her the Mini-Queen, not merely for her resemblance to the late Queen Elizabeth II, but for the striking way she mimicked the Queen's calm poise and quiet strength. There was something undeniable about her gaze, something far older than her age suggested. It was as if the weight of the crown was already resting on her small shoulders, and somehow she was unbothered by it. Her confidence didn't fade as she grew. At public appearances, where even adults falter, Charlotte stood firm. During family balcony moments, when Prince Louis became distracted or overwhelmed, she gently nudged him back in line. When George looked nervous during engagements, it was Charlotte who took his hand, offering not just support, but quiet leadership. These weren't acts taught in royal briefings or rehearsed in back rooms. They came from instinct. Charlotte didn't just perform the role, she embodied it. And nowhere was that more evident than on the day of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. As the nation grieved the end of an era, cameras captured a moment that still haunts the British psyche. Dressed in mourning black, Charlotte stood beside her older brother with a calm that stunned even the most seasoned royal observers. When George's composure cracked and tears welled in his eyes, it was Charlotte, just 7 years old, who leaned in with a whispered word and a comforting glance. Then, in a moment that silenced even the harshest critics of the monarchy, she led him in, bowing to their great-grandmother's coffin. A small gesture, but one that carried the full weight of tradition, love, and legacy. People didn't just admire her. They saw something of the future in her. In a royal family often viewed as rigid and detached, Charlotte represented something softer, more human. She was relatable but regal, approachable yet untouchable. In her, many saw the merging of what the monarchy had always been, and what it now needed to become. She wasn't just a child, she was a symbol, a reminder that power, when guided by grace, could evolve. But behind every composed smile was a child being prepared for a life few could understand, and the pressure was mounting. Leaving Kensington wasn't just a change of address, it was the end of an era for Charlotte and for the royal family. Within the palace walls, Charlotte had taken her first steps, spoken her first words, and lived through the defining moments of her earliest years. Every hallway echoed with memories of innocent laughter, bedtime songs, tearful lessons, whispered conversations between mother and daughter. But those memories, as precious as they were, had begun to suffocate under the weight of expectation. Kensington Palace was no longer a haven. It had become a stage. And Charlotte, though still a child, had grown increasingly aware of the invisible spotlight that never seemed to blink. The decision to move didn't come overnight. It was a calculated shift, a protective response by William and Kate, who had watched their daughter mature under relentless scrutiny. They knew the cameras were no longer lingering in the distance. They were pressing in closer, reading every gesture, every glance, every misstep as symbolic. They saw what the public didn't, the pressure building behind Charlotte's calm demeanor. She was still smiling, still carrying herself with grace, but behind closed doors, the toll was quietly mounting. So they made a choice, not just for her security, but for her soul. Windsor offered something Kensington couldn't anymore: escape. Not from duty, but from the eyes that refused to blink. It meant fewer staff, less ceremony, and more space to simply exist. It meant trading royal tradition for childhood simplicity. But while the world viewed it as a routine relocation, those inside the palace felt the loss like a funeral. Staff who had once held her hand as she learned to walk, who had celebrated her milestones with private tears of joy, now stood silently as her belongings were packed away. No public goodbyes, no fanfare, just the hollow sound of footsteps leaving behind a world that had grown too small. And then she was gone. Not in the dramatic way the media craves. No grand exit, no official press release, no farewell wave from a palace balcony. Just a stillness that crept into every corridor and refused to leave. The silence said everything. Her toys disappeared one by one. Her laughter, once a regular soundtrack, was now a memory. Her room stood cold, untouched, as if frozen in time. For those who had served her, it was more than a departure. It was grief wrapped in protocol. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a rite of passage, a quiet rebellion against the relentless rhythm of royalty. Charlotte didn't vanish. She evolved. She wasn't running from her future. She was being given the rare chance to meet it on her own terms. And though the palace mourned her absence, her parents knew this was the only way to preserve the very essence that had made her extraordinary. But even as she stepped into a quieter life, the world's gaze only intensified, and her influence was just beginning. At just 10 years old, she wasn't just shaping headlines, she was shaping economies. Numbers alone are staggering. Without a single endorsement, without a formal campaign, Princess Charlotte generated an estimated $3 billion in economic impact. Everything she touched, whether it was a cardigan worn on the school run, a backpack spotted in a candid photo, or even the ribbons in her hair, instantly sold out. Brands scrambled to anticipate her next move. Designers whispered her name in marketing meetings. Retailers tracked her public appearances like political polling data. But what made the phenomenon so unusual, so electrifying, was that none of it was orchestrated. She didn't seek influence. It followed her. Because Charlotte's charm wasn't about being polished. It was about being real. While the rest of the royal machine spun around carefully curated photo ops and restrained public statements, Charlotte remained untouched by the choreography. She waved without being prompted. She laughed when something was funny. She comforted her brothers with natural instinct, not trained etiquette. The world didn't fall in love with a princess. They fell in love with a little girl who just happened to be royal. And that innocence, that unfiltered authenticity, made her the rarest kind of public figure. Someone powerful without trying to be. Even the media, often unrelenting in their pursuit of royal drama, handled her presence differently. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. They knew she was different. She walked through flashbulbs with the composure of someone twice her age, her eyes betraying nothing, her posture unwavering. And yet, she never appeared hardened. The spotlight didn't blind her, it barely touched her. It was this balance of maturity without cynicism, poise without detachment, that left commentators reaching for comparisons. And time and again, one name surfaced: Diana. Charlotte didn't mirror her late grandmother's fashion or mannerisms. What she shared with Diana was far deeper and innate emotional intelligence, a presence that disarmed the public, not with grandeur, but with humanity. Diana had touched hands through barricades. Charlotte touched hearts from balconies. Both women, one grown, one still a child, seemed to understand something the institution never could: that the public doesn't want perfection. It wants someone who feels real. And Charlotte, without ever asking for it, had become the embodiment of that desire. But nothing magnified her impact more than her sudden absence. The moment she vanished from public view, the devotion erupted into obsession. Where was she? Why hadn't she been seen? Theories multiplied. Forums lit up. News segments speculated endlessly. Every glimpse of her brothers sparked hope that she might appear beside them. But she didn't. And her silence only deepened the world's fixation. Her invisibility was louder than her presence had ever been. And it became clear. This wasn't just admiration, it was emotional investment. A nation didn't just watch her, they felt protective of her. Yet behind this global adoration was a child yearning for a life beyond the palace walls, and her family knew it. He calls her Manette, a name that says more about their bond than any royal title ever could. To the world, he is Prince William the heir, the statesman, the future king. But to her, he is simply Papa. And in his quietest moments, when the cameras are far and the weight of crowns is lifted, William has always returned to the one place he finds peace beside his daughter, Charlotte. Their connection isn't ceremonial. It's not dictated by titles or protocol. It's deeper, unspoken, built on glances, shared laughter, and a mutual understanding that transcends the cold rigidity of royal life. From the very beginning, Charlotte wasn't just his daughter, she was his anchor. In her, William saw echoes of everything he cherished and everything he had lost. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way she tilted her head in thought, the empathy that shone through her eyes, the courage she showed even when silence would have been easier. She didn't remind him of duty. She reminded him of Diana. The same grace, the same strength, the same ability to walk into a room and shift the atmosphere without saying a word. It wasn't just resemblance, it was spirit. They shared a love for the small, quiet joys, dancing in hallways when the palace slumbered, whispered jokes over breakfast. Music is always music. Charlotte had a fascination with rhythm, with melody, with the same art Diana once clung to in the chaos. William saw it as more than coincidence. It felt like a continuation, a second chance at protecting something precious. And in return, Charlotte gave him something he never asked for, but always needed a sense of grounding. In a world where loyalty is performative and affection must be censored, Charlotte offered him authenticity. She kept him human. So when the decision was made to leave Kensington, it wasn't easy. William had poured himself into that home, built a life inside its walls, planted emotional roots that reached back to his mother's memory. But he knew that staying meant exposing Charlotte to the very shadows he'd spent his life outrunning. Her privacy was worth more than nostalgia. Her freedom mattered more than tradition. He watched her pack. He walked her out. And though he said nothing, something in him cracked. Not out of regret, but love. He had made peace with loss before. But this time, it was on his terms. Even now, he keeps pieces of her close. A photograph in his office, a bracelet she made, a letter she once wrote with the words, "Thank you for always listening." For William, Charlotte isn't just his daughter. She is the reflection of who he once was, and the reason he keeps going. He doesn't need the world to see it. He doesn't need applause. All he needs is that quiet voice calling him by the nickname only she uses. Minette, a name that cuts through the chaos and reminds him that he's not just royalty. He's her father. And while her father's love never faltered, it was her connection with another royal that helped guide her future path. It was the Queen herself, who saw something remarkable in Charlotte and quietly prepared her for something greater. While the world admired Charlotte for her poise and innocence, Queen Elizabeth saw something deeper, something more enduring. In a family bound by tradition and fractured by modern chaos, Charlotte stood out not for her name, but for her nature. She didn't demand attention, she didn't chase affection, but she had a presence, quiet, commanding, steady. And the Queen, who had ruled through war, scandal, and seismic shifts in the monarchy, recognized in her great-granddaughter the same raw steel she had once discovered in herself as a young girl. Not every heir is born with it. Charlotte, somehow, already had it. Those closest to the crown whispered of the bond between the Queen and Charlotte, though it was never displayed for the cameras. Their relationship wasn't forged in ceremony, it was built in quiet moments. Walks through Windsor's sprawling gardens, where Elizabeth would pause not to lecture, but to ask questions. They'd speak of animals, of family, of expectations that most adults would struggle to carry. The Queen never treated Charlotte as a child, she treated her as a future. And Charlotte, in turn, responded not with awe, but with understanding. She listened. She remembered. She grew. It was during those talks that something shifted. Charlotte didn't just mimic royal behavior, she began to embody it. She started to anticipate what was needed before being told. She learned how to stay, composed under pressure. And above all, she grasped the importance of silence, not as a retreat, but as power. Elizabeth taught her that in the royal world, it's not what you say that echoes, it's what you withhold. And in the wake of the Queen's death, that lesson became Charlotte's armor. There are rumors, persistent and never confirmed, that before she passed, the Queen penned a letter to Charlotte, a personal note, sealed with wax and marked to be opened when the time was right. Some believe it contains her final thoughts. Others think it lays out expectations, hopes, even warnings. But no one except Charlotte knows the truth. And no one dares ask. What is certain, however, is that the Queen left more than titles behind. She left a legacy carefully threaded through Charlotte's every decision, in the way she curtsies, in the way she comforts her siblings, in the way she disappears when the noise grows too loud. Even in absence, Elizabeth's presence lives on through Charlotte, a quiet mentor whose influence is etched not in headlines, but in the young girl's every instinct. The Queen had ruled for 70 years through eras of upheaval and reinvention. But in the end, her most powerful act may not have been anything she signed or declared. It may have been what she quietly passed on to Charlotte, the wisdom to endure, to lead, and to do it with grace. And as the world looked to the past for answers, Charlotte was already stepping into a role the world wasn't ready for. Charlotte didn't vanish. She evolved, and where she's headed next may just redefine what royalty means. To the uninformed eye, her disappearance from the public stage looked like retreat, a pause, a withdrawal. But those who understood the depth of what had been unfolding behind palace walls knew better. This wasn't an exit, it was a transformation. Every move, every silence, every step away from the cameras was part of something larger. Charlotte wasn't being hidden, she was being prepared. Not to repeat the past, but to lead something the monarchy had never seen before. Because while the world still clings to old names and faded legacies, Charlotte is quietly becoming the prototype of a new kind of royal. At Lambrook, the elite school nestled in the Berkshire countryside, Charlotte isn't treated like a princess. She's treated like a leader in training. Her curriculum is layered, yes, with the expected royal etiquette and historic responsibility. But more than that, It's built on the things that don't come with a title: empathy, reflection, humility. Her parents have pushed for an education that strengthens the soul as much as the intellect. One where courage isn't measured by a speech, but by a silent act of kindness. Where authority is earned through action, not inherited with privilege. Charlotte isn't just learning how to rule. She's learning how to serve. And that is the difference. She isn't being taught to dominate, but to uplift. To listen before speaking. To observe before acting. It's a kind of quiet leadership that echoes everything the public longed for in Diana and admired in Elizabeth. But unlike them, Charlotte is growing up in an entirely different world, one that demands transparency, relevance, and heart. Her strength isn't in spectacle. It's in restraint, in the choice to remain composed when others would have crumbled, in knowing when to step forward and when to step back. It's no surprise, then, that whispers have started to spread. Among royal watchers, within press circles, and even inside the palace itself, Charlotte, not George, is being spoken of as the future of the crown. Not because she outranks him, but because somehow she already resonates more deeply with the people. She's seen as the bridge, the balance, the hope. And every time she steps out of the spotlight, that image only grows stronger. The less she's seen, the more they believe she's preparing, biding her time, waiting not for permission, but for purpose. Some believe her farewell from Kensington wasn't just an emotional goodbye, it was strategic, a reset, a cleansing of the distractions that come with constant exposure, a retreat not into obscurity, but into reflection. And when she returns, and makes no mistake, she won't come back as a child of the crown. She'll come back as something rarer, a woman of her own making, carrying the lessons of queens before her, but ready to write a story that's entirely her own. But while the palace holds its breath, and the public wonders, those closest to her still grieve her absence. Charlotte didn't say goodbye with words. She left behind memories and hearts that we'll never forget. The moment her departure became real wasn't marked by a press conference or a royal decree. It was marked by something far more human. A chambermaid quietly closes the door to her nursery for the last time. A footman pausing by her empty desk, eyes wet, unsure if he should even enter. Those who had watched her grow, who had helped braid her hair before public outings, who had seen her dancing barefoot on the marble floors of Kensington, suddenly found themselves packing away pieces of her life. Not because she had outgrown them, but because she had outgrown the world they represented. Her beloved toys, each one a symbol of simpler days, were gently wrapped in silence. A well-worn doll with a missing button eye. A music box that still played the lullaby she once requested every night before bed. Notes she had scribbled, drawings she had left taped to the walls. All of it gathered, not by protocol, but by hands that trembled under the weight of emotional finality. Nothing was thrown away. Nothing was rushed. Because each item wasn't just a possession, it was a memory. And in her absence, memories were all that remained. There was no statement issued, no farewell photograph, no carefully crafted narrative from the royal press office. Just a heavy, suffocating silence that said more than words ever could. Those within the palace understood what that meant. The quiet was a decision, a boundary, a signal that this goodbye wasn't meant for the cameras. It belonged to the people who had loved her without needing to understand her legacy, who didn't care that she was third in line or that her name moved markets. They loved the child, not the title. And now, the child is gone. Even the animals sensed it. The royal dogs, once lounging comfortably in her presence, became restless. They no longer curled up near her favorite windowsill. They roamed, uneasy, sniffing the spaces where she used to sit. Her pony, once her pride and joy, stood still longer than usual in the stables, as if waiting for a hand that would no longer come. No one spoke of these changes, but everyone noticed. There was no need for words. Grief had made itself at home, and, still, the world outside kept spinning. People walked past the palace unaware of what had changed inside. But for those who knew, who had witnessed her gentle strength, her quiet leadership, her effortless grace, it wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the closing of a sanctuary. Kensington would never feel the same. The halls echoed differently. The laughter, once so regular, was now a ghost. And though her absence was chosen, even understood, it hurt just the same. And while the world still doesn't know where she's gone or why, one thing is certain: Princess Charlotte may be gone from sight, but her legacy has only just begun. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.